Good morning. Good morning. I request all the participants to please be seated. So, good morning to all, and I welcome you all back to the International Consultation on Biodiversity, Climate Change and Adaptation. We are into the session 4, which would speak about climate adaptation. So the chair of this session is Mr. V. Namashivayam, who is a member, Kerala State Planning Board. We have 4 speakers in this session. 3 of the speakers will be joining us online, and we have 1 speaker, Dr. Madhusudanan, who is offline. So just to give a brief about the chairperson, Mr. Namashivayam is currently the member, Kerala State Planning Board. Mr. Namashivayam served in the Deloitte India Public Sector Private Practice within Consulting and was the organization-wide energy and resource industry lead. He is former trustee of MSSRF and is the India representative on the Global Public Sector Industry team. He has more than 25 years of experience in institutional strengthening, capacity building, change management, and reforms implementation, and he has provided a unique understanding of policy requirements in the Indian context. So now I request Mr. Namashivayam sir to take over the session, and I request him to introduce the speakers. I think currently the first speaker is Dr. Anand Bhattwardhan. So I request Dr. Namashivayam to introduce the speaker.
Thank you. Thank you and good morning to all. I'm not sure whether Dr. Anand Bhattwardhan has joined, but anyway, I will come and see. At the outset, I would like to thank MSSRF for organizing this highly relevant and focused international consultation conclave on climate change. Especially this conclave, unlike many other deliberations we have in the recent times, is bringing the special focus on climate adaptation. In many ways, I feel that the current deliberations on climate change response globally is standing on its head. So, as Dr. Swaminathan, as a trustee, whatever I learned from him, indicates that there are 2 important dimensions. One is the anticipatory research to understand what is likely to happen, as well as the community-centric actions and response required. These 2 dimensions, in many ways, I feel is missing in the current discussions and debate around climate change response and plans. In fact, I would like to congratulate the team which worked on even though it's a short note, the concept note prepared for this conclave. And the concept note clearly lays down the agenda before us. The concept note, for example, talks about the key issues and concerns that today in developing countries especially facing. Those are in terms of the growth in agriculture production, and especially in the context of in the future and any challenges due to climate change and temperature changes. And also, how do we reverse the trend of food insecurity, as well as taking urgent actions to bridge the serious nutritional gaps. Some of these issues are already we are working on and struggling with. There are high level of yield gaps even with the current technology and current environmental context. And there are significant nutritional gaps. And whether these issues which we are working on and further how it will be impacted in the new context is what needs to be done. That's the agenda. No? So the note also points out that the inadequacies of the current policies to bring in focus to these issues and develop a climate response. So in my view that this note and the discussions that we're likely to have will be of immense help. And we in fact have a very eminent panel who worked on all these issues identified in the concept paper, either it is in terms of challenges for continued agriculture growth, how science and technology could help, and what kind of policy responses and changes required, and how do we also involve communities in developing this plan. So we are really looking forward to the deliberations. And in fact, as a Kerala State Planning Board member, I feel that these outcomes and of this conclave will be of great help to the state of Kerala, especially since we are also currently preparing the climate action plan for the state. So this could definitely feed into some of those policies or actions required at the state level. I would like to see whether all the participants have joined now, or yes, I can also see the others. Yeah.
Sir, Chairman, sir, there's a small change. I think first we will invite Dr. Vanya Azevedo, who's the head of the Gene Bank, CIP, Peru. So she'll be the first speaker, as Dr. Anand Bhattwardhan is yet to join. And also I request Dr. Madhusudanan to come to the stage, please. Thank you, sir. You can start.
Okay. So, I mean, as a kind of broad introductory remark, before the session, I would like to point out three important concerns that I've noticed. One is this: how do we bring adaptation as a central strategy for climate response? Today, what is happening is we have a disconnected and isolated action plans, mostly mitigation centric. For example, we noticed that electric vehicles, not just only private, but also in public transportation, while the grid itself is dominated by coal, and we are not able to. There are barriers and challenges towards it. And we talk about climate neutrality at the village and regional level, when the direct emission-related emissions are very minuscule. The indirect emissions constitute 80 to 90% of these places. So we need to see how one could bring in adaptation as a central strategy as a climate response. The second thing is I want to highlight is in terms of on community focus. As I said earlier, that the Dr. Swaminathan and the center, Wayanad Center itself is a good example of how to work with communities. And here I feel that how do we take science and technology to improve the well-being of the communities? And we should also realize here that the futility of aiming a carbon neutral world through offsets. What is currently happening is there is a enormous, they think that agriculture and forestry sector is an easy, low-cost option for mitigation. And hence, there is a lot of money being pushed around to really greenwash. And we should not become a victim of or respond or reactive to those greenwashing policies. But we need to bring in the community welfare, their economic well-being, and the risk mitigation, and the science and technology, as well as infrastructure requirement to mitigate that should be the second focus. The third important issue I feel is adaptation finance, and as we all know that the global debate is mostly around Article 6 and market-based mechanism for mitigation. Even though we had an experience of Kyoto Protocol and its limitations, still continue to be the focus seems to be that the discussions around financing for adaptation is very limited. And in more so in countries and states where we have a framework of Fiscal Responsibility Act, how do we ensure sufficiency of funds and financing for these climate adaptation measures? I think these are the three things, and I see the panelists are extremely well equipped and they've been working on some of these issues. I'm really looking forward to hear from you. As suggested by Dr. Pravavedi, I'll now invite Dr. Vania Azevedo as the first speaker. And Dr. Vania Azevedo is graduated in biological science and has a bachelor in business administration and a PhD in molecular biology, all from University of Brasilia, Brazil. She was a scientist at Impara and Genetic Resources and Biotechnology Unit of Brasilia, and coordinated Embraer's plant genetic resource network of more than 140 gene banks. Dr. Vania is represented Brazil in the SAO Intergovernmental Working Group on Plant Genetic Resources for the Food and Agriculture, and also in ICRISAT, a gene bank head in India. She was a wide experience with in situ and ex situ plant genetic resources and conservation, and gene bank management, quality management, genetic resource policy, molecular characterization, popular genetics, and molecular phylogeny and DNA barcoding. I invite now Dr. Vania Azevedo to present her first lecture. Yeah.
Sir, Chairman, sir, we will give 15 minutes for the speaker, and then we will have the question and answer session later. Okay.
Okay. May I request, doctors?
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here talking a little bit about our work with the potatoes here in the Andes region in Peru. I believe you can see my presentation. Am I correct?
Yes, please proceed.
Thank you. I will switch off the camera just because of to avoid any internet connection issues. Okay. So, well, once again, thank you very much for the invitation. And what happened here? Yeah. So I will talk very briefly about the link between ex situ and in situ conservation of potato land races here in Peru. It's a very interesting work that CAbC has been doing with the farmers for many, many years. And it has been allowing us to really promote a very efficient conservation of the land races, especially of potatoes, but not only. So the Andes, here in the region of not only Peru, but it goes through Bolivia, Chile, and it's a very interesting and different and specific area due to the high altitude and low temperature. So it has its own crop diversity. It has a significant diversity of food that has been used by the farmers for many years. If we go back to the Peruvian history, even before the Incas, there is a lot of on-farming conservation and cultivation of traditional crops from this region, lots of them who are endemic. And not only crops, but also there is a significant source of zoogenetic resources as well. And a high diversity of medicinal plants and oil plants that the traditional communities and the indigenous communities use on a daily basis in this very specific environment. So we find more than the potato and, of course, lots of wild relatives of sweet potato, a lot of tubers and roots and tubers that are for long used by the farmers and by the communities in Peru. And we do have a strong connection between supporting the in situ conservation or on-farm conservation by the local communities and with the CAbC gene bank. So the Andes, we can say that this region constitutes a living laboratory where we can really do a very significant integrated conservation approach. There is a specific decree from the government recognizing the agrobiodiversity in the region and the necessity of conservation of the traditional knowledge and the agrobiodiversity in the region. What helps us, of course, in developing interesting projects and in getting support as well from donors to continue developing this work with the farmers in Peru and constantly linking the in situ conservation and the ex situ conservation, which is for us extremely important. So the farmers here in the region, they, as I already said, they do recognize and they use significantly the agrobiodiversity. We have significant different levels of landscapes and parks. So lots of areas of reserve areas where the traditional farming and the traditional knowledge is kept. And the farmers in Peru are very well organized in associations. They have a lot of support from NGOs. So Aguapan, for example, is an association of farmers with more than 100 communities and families with whom we have been working significantly, not only in conserving, but also in promoting the use and the commercialization of their own land races. And this, of course, supports the reaffirmation of their culture and the conservation of the culture more than the conservation of the crop itself. And there is a lot of work in the level of seed conservation in terms of community seed banks and collaboration with the ex situ gene banks. And there is a significant diversity where we could establish a significant work in cataloging the land races. I will show a little bit about it in the next minutes. And also, we could go deeper and support the farmers in many different ways, including in promoting the culinary and the books with the different recipes, and Peruvian chefs have been showing how rich this diversity is from Peru, and it is more popularized even outside Peru since the past years, which is extremely interesting. So when we see the distribution of potato, it is very clear that the wild relatives in the first picture, well, the use of the potato diversity in Peru is huge. So potato is a crop that everybody in the world eats, but we know basically one or two kinds of potato in most of our countries. And when you come to a country like Peru, you can easily find 10, 15 different types of potatoes in the supermarket. And when you go closer to the communities, you can find 30, 50 different types of potatoes. And this map shows clearly that potato is cultivated from north to south and mostly in the Andes in high altitude. And also the crop wild relatives also occur in this region in the second figure. So we used the information, the knowledge that we already have, plus the information about conservation. And also we have been developing works related to gap analysis to identify where we might have not collected any material yet. Of course, we look for integration and collaboration with the farmers so we can continue collaborating them and enriching the diversity of the gene bank with new sources of variability. So the first picture here is just an illustration of a few land races of one farmer only. And each one of these different colors and formats and sizes. Is a different variety of potato that this farmer only is planting in his area. And it's very common that the farmers in Peru, they plant the different varieties all together, because that's the best way that they have to guarantee that at the end, they will have food. They will have what to harvest. Because as we all know, we are facing new challenges with climate change, with rising of temperature, or sometimes winters that are much colder, or lack of water. So some varieties might be more susceptible to some conditions than others. So this is a very traditional way of cultivating potato in Peru for hundreds and hundreds of years. And that's how they continue cultivating them. And in the second photo is one example of one wild relative of potato in the Andes. So when we talk about the in situ conservation, as I said since the beginning, it's much more than just the farmer conserving the crop itself and sowing and harvesting and eating. We need to consider many other aspects related to what the traditional farmers are doing and all the knowledge associated to that. So, well, the folk taxonomy, how they do describe their materials, is something that helps us a lot in understanding the diversity of a crop. So potato, for example, today we have 2 authors and not a defined number of species yet. So there is a lot in taxonomy or still ongoing, and possibly because of natural hybrids and well, a very, very high diversity, more than 200 species, most probably. The crops are related to food, to medicinal use, oil, and many other uses, including culture. So for rituals, for dances, for offerings, even astrology, there are many different uses. So the traditional knowledge is much more than sowing and harvesting. There is a whole culture behind the long-term use of these materials by the farmers. And well, here are just a few examples of how they celebrate, how they eat, the kind of food they have. There is a very traditional food here called pachamanca. It's where after harvesting, they cook all the varieties of potato with some meat under the soil and with hot rocks. And then they, well, eat all together to celebrate the harvesting. And then, so what about the collaboration? Although both of us, in situ and ex situ, are trying to maintain the long-term conservation of these crops, the level and the objectives are different. So at the Gene Bank, we are a backup of their materials. We continue monitoring the diversity and the long-term conservation. It's a complementary knowledge when we will apply science in characterizing molecularly or phenotypically the material. And also we need to consider a significant level of reciprocity to do this work with them, recognize their knowledge, and also recognize that we must be able to repatriate and reincorporate this material to the farmers whenever they need them back. And we have been doing that for a long term. While the farmers are the ones that are allowing the evolution of these crops in the fields, are introducing different species, different cultivars, exchanging material among themselves, and it's where the crops are evolving over the years. And what we do is to do this work together with them by monitoring in different levels the work that they have been doing and in mapping the distribution of the different cultivars. So in the first picture, we can see, for example, in terms of ploidy, so where different ploidies of potato are being planted in Peru and how, so we can understand which varieties are more interesting for the different farmers and where we can find the specific sources of diversity. So more than monitoring the general distribution in the country, but also how the communities are doing it and also providing support whenever needed, the agricultures, the kind of cultivars, the varieties, and the genes by doing lots of molecular characterization. So here we can just see, well, these names in Spanish are the names of the most common varieties in the different regions. And as I said, from north to south. And recently we published this the baseline, the catalogs with the information about the potato being cultivated in different regions in Peru. Some of them are completely concluded and some of them are still ongoing. So this first photo is the front page of the book. It's the native potato catalog. And here one example of the kind of information that we have. There is some molecular characterization and the characteristics of the potato, photos, different traits. So this helps the farmers significantly and also help us in identifying which are the crops or which are the varieties, sorry, that are more abundant in different communities and the ones that are least abundant, so we can identify which ones might be under bigger risk. So more monitoring and more collaboration with the farmers must be done to guarantee that we will maintain a copy of them in the ex-situ conservation, doing the ex-situ conservation strategy to guarantee that these crops will not be lost. And here is one example of the distribution of different varieties per group of communities. So we also understand how they share, which varieties they share more and with whom, so we can understand a little bit more on the evolution of these varieties in the field. And recently, an app was developed to help them identify their varieties. So this app, they can read, you see in this picture here on the top, with their phones, they can take a photo of the picture if they are in doubt or if they are in a fair and they are going to exchange with another farmer. They can identify which variety it is, if they already have it, if they are interested in this variety or not. So the farmers are very happy with this app, and all this work could not be done without the participation of this association called Aguapal.
Dr. Vania, excuse me, 1 more minute to wind up. 1 more minute. You have 1 more minute.
I thought I had 20 minutes, no?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Please,
I'm marking, yeah, I thought I had a 5, but
yeah,
it's okay.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, so I will go to show one specific study where we collaborated with 2 areas in Peru, in Pasco and Sierra de Lima, where multiple communities provided varieties to us and CIP, so we could genotype. So we received more than 1,000 different varieties as per the traditional knowledge that they have and the traditional taxonomy that they give. And with that, we did molecular and phenotypic characterization. We did DART-seq, and we could understand how the varieties that the farmers are using are distributed. And we also compared with the CIP collection, which has around 5,000 accessions. So we could understand how their varieties are related to the commercial varieties, which are this one in purple up here. The level of ploidy, so most of them are tetraploids, but there are also many others. And also how the varieties in the different group of communities are distributed. So in green, we see Pasco, and in pink we see Sierra de Lima. And also, and where there is no color here are the accessions of the gene bank. So we could see that there is areas that we have material in the gene bank that the farmers are not using, at least in this region. And with this study, we could identify 88 varieties that are not conserved in CIP gene bank yet, that were, well, there is absolutely no diversity related to these varieties in our gene bank. And due to the long-term collaboration that we have with them, they donated to CIP gene bank these 88 new varieties, new sources of diversity, very important, under the terms of the treaty. So allowing CIP to distribute under an SMTA of the treaty to any user in the world, and knowing that we will give it back to them and whenever they need. So there is more than 20 years that we have a program with the farmers in Peru where we repatriate their land races. So just an analysis of the past 5 years, we answered requests from 39 traditional communities and 5 farmer associations like Aguapan, and more than 3,400 accessions were repatriated to the farmers, meaning more than 25,000 mini tubers that we sent back to them. And after that, well, I could talk for a whole week about all the work and all the studies that we have been doing, but we clearly see that every time they have issues, for example, with virus contamination, and we repatriate the material clean, their yield increase significantly, what consequently will increase in their livelihoods at the end. And as just a general information, in CIP Gene Bank, we conserve more than potato. We conserve also some Andean roots and tubers, crops, and sweet potato. And in total, we have around 13,000 accessions, and most of them available for distribution under the treaty. I think, well, I will stop here. I was just here going to mention some things about use. In this slide, we can see clearly how the local varieties and the land races are important, while a modern variety on the top here did not resist to frost. The traditional varieties that the farmers constantly plant, they do resist to frost. So, well, there are many reasons why they want to continue working with their land races and want our support to continue helping them improving their varieties. And as I said, they officially commercialize their native potatoes in this kit called Miski Papa, and you can order online. So they are very modern and recognized in the country. So the commercialization of the land races is something formal, which caused a significant positive impact in the farmers' livelihood. And the clients can even share the recipes and how good their potato is. That's it. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I request you to wait online to take up some questions at the end of the session. Thank you very much for that nice presentation. Sir, can we invite the next speaker, Dr. Purvi Mehta? Chairman, sir?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Yes, please. Yeah, you can go. Yeah. Thank you very much for the earlier speaker for all the sharing how science and technology is able to maintain the tradition of potato cultivation. Maybe at the discussion time, we may be able to cover up how this base foundational scientific infrastructure is helping to respond to climate change. Just to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Purvi Mehta leads the Bill and Melinda Gates Agriculture development work in Asia. She is closely involved with several agriculture and nutrition policy platforms in India, Southeast Asia, and Africa. She serves on the board of several organizations, including International Alliance for Ecology, Health Canada, International Center for Rural Agriculture, and India's National Commodity and Derivatives Exchange Limited. And is also a member of the World Food Prize Foundation's Councils of Advisors. Dr. Purvi is a honorary professor at MIT University and a visiting scientist at Cornell University. I invite now to share Dr. Purvi Mehta for presentation. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Namah Shivayam, and congratulations to the MSSRF for organizing this very, very interesting, important event. I was looking at the agenda from yesterday and today, and it's a very, very interesting set of topics that you are covering. For me, there is always a personal meaning to be a part of any MSSRF activities. I have always considered Dr. Swaminathan as my guru, but as we now speak about climate change, climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and so forth, it also comes as a reminder that, Professor Swaminathan was one of the first people in his first book, in fact, he talked about climate. So we all, in any international organizations that we work in, we are all influenced by the vision that he has provided, and the continuum that the Swaminathan Foundation now has with of course, Dr. Madhura Swaminathan in the leadership. I have deep appreciation for Dr. Madhura's vision and leadership. She and I work on a few councils together, and I always really appreciate the way she represents India in many of those global forums. So really very, very happy to be here, and thank you all for the invitation. I was also intrigued by the set of topics that was covered, which is following the World Environment Day. If 5th of June, it comes as a reminder, and it kind of reminds us of the real problems of climate change. I think talking about climate adaptation on 6th of June, which is talking about the solutions on the climate change and how are we planning to cope with it, is going to be very important as well. So thanks again for that. The climate crisis increasingly really threatens farming populations and national food systems. So both farming system and food system, literally creating headwinds against our efforts to advance inclusive agriculture transformation around the world. Climate change, as we all know, is estimated to swell the global poverty levels by about 130 million people by 2030, which is not very far from us. It's we're talking about in 8 years' time, the global poverty level will be higher by 130 million people due to the various shocks of climate that the people will experience. And among those people who will get hit by climate, small scale farmers or small scale producers or agro producers, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, will be very, very prominent. So agriculture has made a lot of strides. I mean, while we all know that agriculture productivity doubled, right, in the world between 1961 and 2015, the growth, even if we really have doubled the productivity between 61 and 2015, the growth would have been 20% higher if it wasn't for the climate-related impact. So it is almost a loss equivalent to about 7 years of productivity gain. So it has had a major impact on agriculture, especially on agriculture and among agriculture, especially on smallholder farmers. And so this kind of a productivity drag, as I would call it, is something that we will all have to deal with. And that's the reason I think adaptation becomes a very, very important part. I know, I saw in the note that was circulated also that South Asia, of course, the impact of climate and the need for climate adaptation is going to be very, very high because South Asia hosts some of the world's most hotspots countries. But if you see sub-Saharan Africa also, where basically elevated temperature and shortening of the growing season are and the 2 degrees centigrade reality of temperature increase, it will impact about 230 million hectares of cropland and about close to 250 million livestock. So I think these are some real problems, and these are not just the problems of agriculture. These are the problems of food system, of nutrition, of social angle. And I really appreciate the way MSSRF looks at this issue, not just from an agriculture perspective, but from a very wider holistic perspective. And so I think what is very, very required as we talk about climate adaptation is not just the ecological impact, but also the economic impact. Economic impact, not just on the wider scale or the impact on countries and so forth, but impact on a household, on a smallholder farmer or a small consumer. So I think these are going to be very, very important. And one of the things that one notices is if you see the new money that has come in agriculture in last 4 years, right? Which is the new commitments from various financial institutions, including donors and bilateral agencies and so forth. About 80% of that has been in the area of climate, which is good, right? Because this is an area we all realize needs a lot of attention, it needs a lot of finance, it needs a lot of effort. But if you double click on that money that has come, or that investments that have come around the world, close to 80% of that has come on mitigation. Right? How do we minimize the perils of climate, which is of course very, very important. But given that it is a reality, I think we also need to start adapting ourselves and starts having effort in sort of facing the reality, which is the climate adaptation. And therefore, I think it really calls for much more effort, much more energy and investment into adaptation part also. Another very interesting fact about climate is that a large number of work that has been done in terms of climate has been in diagnosing the problem, in creating data of how bad the situation is, in creating data as to what are the threats it's going to focus and all that. And we have some very, very robust data, whether it is the IPCC or many, many of those reports. Extremely important. But I think there is much more effort now needed. I don't think anybody needs to be convinced that there are problems coming because of the climate change, and therefore I think a lot more effort is now required for creating some solutions, creating, if nothing else, some kind of an inventory of what are the various solution-oriented efforts that is happening around the world, and how do we make a co-learning platform for that. So given some of this, and given that there are a number of discussions that has been lined up in this meeting also, I just wanted to bring a few points which are more from a solution perspective, right? Number one was innovation for impact. I think accelerating innovation for next generation product in crop and livestock to prepare our crop and livestock systems or farming systems. And I always like to say crop and livestock in one breath, being in India, because it is not about crop farming or it is not about livestock farming. It is about mixed farming system, where crop and livestock are very, very integral part of a farmer's livelihood system or our agriculture system. And therefore an innovation that really helps them be much more resilient, right? Whether it is the seed sector, for example, in crops, right? What are the, our seed system predominantly has been on focusing on yield. Whatever variety yields much more, we have been promoting those varieties, and fair enough, right? Because that was the requirement. And I'm not saying that we have solved all the problems of productivity. We still need yield. We still need more food production. But I think a shift towards more resilient varieties is going to be very, very important. And that includes, when the public sector sort of suggests any seed varieties to the farmer, let's not look at it only from a high yielding seed variety perspective, but also there is a real need to look at various seeds or various commodities which are much more resilient to biotic stresses and adapt to the farming system, right? That's in the staple crops. Also, how do we shift from staple crops to more diversified commodities, which becomes like a risk adaptation, risk management, risk mitigation strategy for a farmer? And I know, through various biodiversity programs that the foundation does, the Swaminathan Foundation does, there are a large number of such varieties. So I think with diversification and adoption, not just from a staple crop perspective, but also from a diversified crop perspective. Shortened breeding cycle is another thing that is going to be very, very important. Again, our breeding programs have not been really governed towards the breeding timing or the breeding cycles, and therefore there are lots of opportunity for specifically for climate adaptation, where one can bring some of these breeding cycles. The second one I wanted to say, apart from innovation, is leverage and leadership. I think, while the world individually, or donors individually, or countries individually are trying their bit to bring in some climate adaptation work, this is such a large program, and we have learned from many other programs in the past and in the history. This is a challenge which has to have combined effort. And therefore, leveraging on what is already going on rather than duplicating the effort is going to be very, very crucial for us to be able to make any dent. And that includes in the entire space of climate finance that is opening up. Climate finance is also the space where public sector, private sector will play an equally important role. And I think it's the question of how to leverage upon these capacity. The second one is also, I think, in my role as someone who leads the Gates Foundation's climate adaptation work, I've seen in the world, and including in the COP type discussions and things like that, a lot of the discussions happen at a very, very large policy level. Again, very important. Policy integration will be very, very important in this. But one sees missing of voices from the ground. And this is going to be very important. The WRI has recently done some study which shows, at least 70-75% of the effort in climate adaptation is actually at a very broad international policy level, and it is not really touching the ground. And therefore, I think that two-way traffic between the ground reality being communicated to these very large international missions is going to be very, very important. And the third in leverage and leadership I wanted to say is, again, focusing on solution and not just on the problem in the terms of, diagnosing the problem. I think there are a large number of global public good. There is if you see just last 1 year where...
Dr. Purvi, sorry, another 3 more minutes, yeah.
Oh, right, okay. So there are a large number of those kind of public sector investment. There is a $230 million that was released only for creating developing country climate adaptation solutions. What part of that really hits the ground is something that's going to be very, very important for mapping. So I think in conclusion, I'd like to say that climate adaptation, facing the problem and not just climate mitigation and trying to avoid the problem, both important, but adaptation also has now become very, very important. The economic impact of climate change and not just ecological impact of climate change will be very important. Doing any of this at an inclusive angle, which means mixed farming system, all sectors of farming, crop, livestock, horticulture, aquaculture, everything. Uh, uh, Gender and livelihood angle, and not just from a farming and agriculture system angle. Markets angle, because it is the markets which gives that resilience and the buffer to the farmer, and therefore turning income as one of the buffer mechanism, the cost of finance, and combining our voice. So I think I just wanted to bring some of these broad aspects to for the panel to further focus, and once again, congratulations, and let's really look at some of the ways in which some of these different aspects of climate change can be brought together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Puri Mehta, for an excellent presentation. You brought to our attention the current challenge of the productivity lag and the need for attention in this regard, especially in the changing climate context. You also told us that we have done enough about various scenario planning and what is likely to happen, but it is time for also to focus on solutions and actions that could work to meet these broader changes. You also mentioned about the climate finance challenges, especially most of the money that is coming from for agriculture sector is mitigation oriented, and there is a need for reorientation. I think it's well taken. Maybe at the time of the discussions and question hours, we could also talk about how the resilience and other risk mitigation measures could be brought in. Thank you once again for your excellent presentation. May I invite the next speaker?
Sir, 1 minute. The next speaker will be Dr. Madhusudanan.
Yes.
So we'll have Dr. Anand Bhattwardhan, last speaker. Yeah,
yes, I saw that chat box there. Yeah. Dr. Madhusudanan's research work focuses on understanding natural resources, interlinkages in India in the wake of extensive human interventions in climate change. He holds a PhD in water resources engineering from the Department of Civil Engineering, IIT Mumbai. He was a principal investigator of the project on Kerala floods in 2018, the causes and risk mitigation strategy, a project for Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration, funded by the National Disaster Management Authority. Dr. Madhusudanan is an expert in the assessment of hydrological impact of climate and human intervention of energy, land, water, climate nexus, climate change assessments, tropical hydrology, hydrological modeling, and integrated river basin management and water conflicts, and agriculture transition and vegetation dynamics and natural resource management. I invite Dr. Madhusudanan to, I think he is present there, so I invite him to speak. Yeah, thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Chairman, for giving a nice introduction. And yeah, fine. Can you hear? No. Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Mic is. So I think
the presentation is coming along with your notes. I don't know whether. Just check what, yeah.
So, so when you start with my presentation, I would like to tell you about my journey. So I would like to introduce myself as a civil engineer, and looking at the climate change and things when I went to do my PhD, and later from a very scientific modeling work, data intensive modeling work. Now while looking at it, how communities can be will be involved and engaged to co-create something like a community-sourced modeling and modeling solutions. So when I look at these kind of aspects related to community engagement in completely scientific realms, we always think that communities cannot understand, communities cannot engage in real scientific engagements and scientific studies and providing scientific outputs. So my first understanding, when I looked closely into the scientific outputs of IPCC reports, the real climate model outputs, especially looking at the rainfall projections of general circulation models, that's the global climate models. You know that these projections are highly, one thing, erroneous. The second thing is highly unpredictable. And the third thing is there are lots of uncertainties involved in it. So looking at why these global projections and global models provide such kind of erroneous results and which cannot be dependent upon for understanding future changes and all. I look deeply look into what are the processes they actually incorporate in these modeling processes. So when you look at these evolution of these climate models and all, you know that these local processes are not always really captured in these global models. So when you look at a country like India, where we have a diverse systems, complex systems of agriculture, irrigation, power generation, and then our water utilization and all, when you look at from a global perspective, India, it's a highly complex system where we have the greatest land under agriculture, and we have the greatest amount of area under irrigation when you look at the global scale, and we are the third largest producer of electricity and consumption of electricity when you look at it. And we have the second largest population, and when you look at the population density across India, it's highly densely populated. So these things are most often not directly or indirectly incorporated in these global models. And when you look at the fluxes that is generated from these global models, when you look at the evapotranspiration and other kinds of fluxes, you know that's highly underestimated and highly underrepresented from a place like India, where most of the processes are based on these land surface processes. So my work was basically looked at the uncertainties in, again, database uncertainties, when errors, when we have multiple data sets of land use, land cover, and when you model these land use and land cover in various global models, you get different kinds of results, and that all comes to various kinds of erroneous outputs and things like that. And we all depend upon these reports and results of IPCC to say that our world is changing in this manner and this much. So when I have done a study on the impact of irrigation on the outputs of basically various kinds of land surface processes, land surface fluxes, especially ET, I found that it is highly underestimated when I looked at the Indian scenario. And this has huge impact on our irrigation, I mean our rainfall generation and other processes. So understanding these unreliability of these projections and prospects, I thought that there should be much more dependent sources and dependent ways in which we should understand and look at various kinds of kind of things. And that really led to my ways. When I came back to Kerala, what happened is the Kerala floods just after my PhD. And I was trying to reach to the various administrators before the floods, even one month before the flood, by looking at various data sets and seeing the reservoir conditions and rainfall conditions. I was pretty sure that there will be a flood, and it will be a reservoir-induced flood. And I was trying to reach out the district administration, district collectors of Thrissur district and Ernakulam district particularly, and telling them that this is what is going to happen in your area, and you have to do these things, listing all these, what all things you can do before the floods to reduce the risks of such a massive kind of a flood. Especially your reservoirs, much of them are interstate, and you don't have any control. So this was my letter to the district collector of Thrissur, specifying the various possibility of a dam-induced disaster. So when I reached out to them, the reality came out that they don't have a system. The administration does not have a system even to check whether what I am saying is right or wrong. So I have directly contacted the administration, and the administration, the district collector told me that, yeah, she will look into the departments, talk to the departments, and come back to me. But the problem was that the department has no system to look at whether that will be right or wrong. And again, that went on for a month, and the real flood happened, and we could not do much. And this was my first eye-opener that the systems cannot be dependent on such crises, especially, and we need to have an independent or maybe even an integrated system where people can directly link to all these things and co-create some kind of disaster preparedness and disaster monitoring, and maybe even forecasting system where people can directly involve and monitor things on the ground, and even warn the government at times. So even just after the floods, the government of India's National Disaster Management Authority and Lal Bahadur's National Academy Administration involved, given us a project to look at the various causes and risk mitigation strategies related to the Kerala floods of 2018. And this was an eye-opener to me and our team, that our systems are so weak, so wrecked, that it is not going to give any immediate results when you look at the preparedness, disaster. We are very good at handling the situation once it has happened. Our administrators are pretty good, but when you have a warning kind of a system, we don't have a warning system when you look at the flood warnings, and even if you disaster preparedness way and disaster risk reduction strategies, we don't have much leverage in those areas, and we are all waiting for the disasters to happen, to act. So with this, and again with some other kind of involvement with Cochin International Airport to build their disaster risk reduction plans and all, I could possibly look into a much of wider networks, because these independent individual institutions cannot do much when it is a larger area, when you look at a river basin like Periyar or Chalukudi. And that really was an opening thing with one of my friend, Shajan, who's here. And he really helped me to build a system, very local system, where we can really integrate local people and engage communities to really build database on rainfall, river flows, and even groundwater levels. Because in Kerala, when you want to understand floods, your groundwater is the major factor which actually contributes to floods. So we have a different kind of hydrological systems than other parts of India, where our groundwater dominates the flood waters. So this is basically when the thresholds, when you have a much higher rainfall, and after the rainfall your groundwaters are recharged, and if there is another heavy rainfall, all these water which is stored in your well or maybe in the ground, soil, which will be released in a faster, quicker way through various kinds of soil pipes. So these kind of pipes which will give us a much faster way to the streams, and that is contributing a major havoc in the downstream region. So understanding flood is even a major scientific problem in these areas, and we continuously engage with the government and warning the government about the recent flood events and things like that, but government missionaries are not even equipped to understand these warnings and what to do with these warnings, basically. So we thought that, yeah, this is not going to work from a government perspective when you give warnings, because again, you cannot give warnings under the Disaster Management Act of 2005. An individual cannot provide warning, only the government agencies should provide the warning. If you provide a warning, you can be penalized under the various sections under the Disaster Management Act. So, this criteria again restricted our understanding, or maybe even giving a public thing related to the warnings related to various kinds of disasters. So here I thought, yeah, what is the way out for this particular situation? So if communities are aware of this disaster, if they can understand this disaster, if they can forewarn themselves about these disasters, government can do anything. And even the people can even warn the government. So this is what happened during the last year when the people of Puthanvelikara, maybe the people of CRC, this Community Resource Center of Puthanvelikara, warned the district collector that we had a huge rainfall last day of 200 millimeter, and there's a possibility of heavy flow from the upstream, and our sand bend is going to be break tomorrow, and you have to manage your gates. Otherwise, all the tidal floods that may come in the next few days and will enter into our lands and all. So this was actually a warning that is provided by the community to the district administration, and even the district administration should not take it in that the spirits
and 2 more minutes, please.
And the spirit and this is but the major factor that people could do there is they engage local people to raise the shutters and avoid a huge disaster. So communities directly involved in decision making, even in implementation of these things, and even maybe it may be unlawful when you think from the perspective of government that so people are operating irrigation structures without the permission of the government. But the government is not ready to do such things, and huge disasters are in peril, and they are making the peril. So the communities are forced to do such kind of things. So there's a huge issue that is there in the field, and people are really looking for solutions in various kinds of things. This is our rainfall, web-based rainfall monitoring system, and this is the reservoir monitoring system from where we collect and collect the information and look at what are the possibilities of various kinds of flood warnings that we can produce. And we have really engaged with local engineering colleges, students and other community members to build these systems. And we are now at a stage where we have received a funding from all this work. When you look at all these work are done voluntarily without any funding, and now we are going to receive a fund from the US Fulbright Alumni Association, and that where we will be collaborating with MSSRF to implement it in the field, in the coastal stretches of Ernakulam district to come up with a disaster risk reduction plan for tidal flooding in the coastal areas of Ernakulam.
Please wind up.
Yeah.
Time up.
Thank you.
Sir, the next speaker will be Dr. Anand Bhattwardhan. Chairman, sir, I request you to introduce him.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Madhusudan, for bringing and highlighting the importance of state region-specific modeling and requirements, and the global limitations of the global models for specific actions at the local level. I think this, as a planning board member, I know that this 14-fire plan period, the disaster management is being taken up to the local self-government. The capacity building of institutions, what you highlighted is very critical and important, and we'll discuss that now post this conference, how we could do that. I now invite the next speaker, Dr. Anand Bhattwardhan, a professor at the Center of Global Sustainability, University of Maryland. And Dr. Bhattwardhan has a BTech in electrical engineering from IIT Bombay and holds MS in environmental science and engineering and PhD engineering and public policy from Carnegie Mellon University. He has been a member of scientific and technical advisory panel of the Global Environmental Facility and coordinating the lead author for the 4th and 5th assessment reports of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. Dr. Bhattwardhan is currently a co-chair and executive committee of the Global Energy Assessment and is a member of the steering committee of the Program of Research of Vulnerability, Impacts and Adaptation of United Nations Environmental Program. Dr. Bhattwardhan, I request you to make your presentation. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here, although I must say it is a bit late in the day for me, getting to be past midnight, so I hope I am still awake by the time we conclude, and I don't put you all to sleep, though. So I hope you can see my presentation.
Yes, please.
All right, very well. I was originally scheduled yesterday, but due to some difficulties, I could not attend. What I had hoped to do, following the advice of Professor Jayaraman, who contacted me to speak here, was to really talk a little bit about adaptation. I think we have heard some very rich details and information about biodiversity, conservation, smallholder agriculture, and solutions for that from our earlier speakers. What I thought I would do was step back a little bit and take a broader view of adaptation, and in particular what it is and how we can think of really a national strategy for climate change adaptation. And I hope to stick to the time. I'm going to, in this presentation, try and at least partially answer three questions. First is sort of, why does it matter? Why is it important? And I will suggest two answers to that question, that there is sort of the reality of climate change, but also the benefits of adaptation. If it's such a good thing, obviously the question might arise is, why is more of it not happening? Why don't we see as much action and implementation when it comes to adaptation? And I'll touch upon a little bit some of the barriers that are preventing adaptation happening at the urgency and scale needed. And then the third question is really, okay, so that's all fine, but what do we do? How do we think about what we might call a national adaptation strategy? What's our strategy? For a long time, I used to teach in the business school at IIT Bombay, Mumbai, and the favorite subject for students used to be strategic management. Right? So how do we figure out what strategy should be? And then, of course, a lot of it depends on its execution. We can have the perfect strategy, but if it's not executed or not executed well, we will not see the results that we hope for. But before coming to the question of why does it matter, maybe I thought it might be helpful for this audience for just give a very stylized glimpse of what is adaptation from the perspective of someone who's worked for many, many years in the IPCC process. And over the years, over the last 3 decades, the IPCC has, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has evolved in its own thinking about adaptation. Way back in the beginning, the first assessment report, adaptation was viewed purely as an adjustment. There is climate change, we adjust, and that's what we do. In the second assessment, the whole idea of adaptation as something that reduces impacts to produce net impacts became very popular. By the time of the third assessment, it was recognized that vulnerability and adaptive capacity are issues in their own right. There is, of course, climate change, but the reason we are vulnerable to climate change is not just because of the hazard, but it's really fundamentally because of a lot of the deficits, developmental deficits, institutional deficits, lack of capacity that make us exposed and vulnerable in the first place. Yes, so climate is important, but we really need to look at these underlying aspects of vulnerability and adaptive capacity. This perception and this view has only strengthened over the years. The fourth assessment report looked at adaptation really as an element of a much more complex view of climate-society interactions. The idea of mainstreaming became very popular. In the fifth assessment report, the whole notion of adaptation really as iterative risk management, that it is something that we do continually in an ongoing basis, in an iterative basis, and we use it to manage risks, became dominant. And then this has seen to its sort of final conclusion in the sixth assessment report now, where the AR6...
May I request the others to put the mic on mute? I think there's some noises are coming. Thank you.
Sorry. Yeah, to really fold adaptation into the concept of climate resilient development, really bring it much more squarely into the development agenda. So if that sort of long-term historical view of adaptation, let's turn to the first question. Well, one of the reasons why adaptation matters is because climate change is not a problem of the future. It is in the here and now. It is not an issue of 2050, it is an issue of 2022. Whether it's in terms of heat waves, droughts, increased intensity of storms, whether it's appearing through wildfires in many parts of the world. It's the signal of climate change is being seen now in biophysical impacts today. And so clearly, we are looking at not some long-term, far-off, remote threat, but we're looking at an immediate threat. And this is mirrored. So if you look at how the business community now thinks about climate risk, this is the World Economic Forum Risk Perception Survey. It ranks quite high, higher than even things like cyber attacks or data fraud and theft, which we might imagine preoccupy many business executives today. Of course, we are committed to, under the Paris Agreement, to try and hold warming to well below 2 degrees. But even at 1.5 to 2 degrees, impacts will be significant. There will be many regions that will be hit very hard. And in fact, if you look at the current trajectory of emissions, we are nowhere near 1.5 or 2 degrees. The AR6 suggests that a current emission pathways would likely lead to anywhere from 2.8 to 3.2 degrees of warming. Now, risks increase rapidly with temperature. And therefore, from a risk management perspective, which is what the IPCC advocated in the fifth assessment report, we really need to think, what we are doing today, how robust is it to the full range of climate impacts, not just to the future we hope we will reach, which is the 1.5 or 2 degree target of the Paris Agreement, but to the possibility that we might end up with a much higher level of climate change. So what can we say about what should we do differently today? What should we do more today? What should we do new today to help us prepare for the possibility of a much warmer future? As I said, risks do increase rapidly with temperature, in some cases non-linearly. So how do we think of adaptation? We think of adaptation primarily as risk reduction. We want to avoid or reduce some of these possible future losses with climate change. But avoided losses are just one aspect of some of the potential multiple benefits of adaptation. It's not just avoided losses. When we reduce risk and when we better manage risk, it gives us economic benefits. It also gives us co-benefits in terms of social and environmental benefits. And this triple dividend is one reason why adaptation is something worth pursuing in any event. The economics of adaptation are compelling. In some of the work we did with the Global Commission on Adaptation a couple of years ago, we found that we had very significant benefit cost ratios of investing in things like early warning systems, climate resilient infrastructure, improved crop production, water security, that these investments had large payoffs, that these were not marginal by any means, but they could be justified by these triple dividends. So one might ask the question, if this is such a good thing, the benefits are compelling, the need is urgent, why is action fragmented? Why is it halting? Why is it subcritical? Right. So if you think about it, there is talk about adaptation. But many cases, it has remained at planning, very little implementation. Adaptation finance, as other speakers have said, has been very slow to take off. So despite the need and the benefits, why is more not happening? Why are we not seeing that scale of action? I would suggest that there are many barriers, of course, but there's three that seem to be particularly important. The first is, I would say, quite a fundamental issue of awareness and understanding. We often say the starting point is right understanding. Well, part of the challenge of adaptation has been that it has always been held hostage to this adaptation versus mitigation dichotomy. That On the one hand, if mitigation is successful and we succeed in limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, then we shouldn't really need to do much by way of adaptation. After all, that's the whole goal of the climate target. But at the same time, if you focus on adaptation, then it almost seems that we are throwing in the towel on mitigation. We're accepting defeat. And this dichotomy has really, in some ways, held back the global narrative. The second is the lack of understanding of climate futures. What are we adapting to? That's very uncertain. We don't really know what we are adapting to, and we will not know with certainty
Sir, 1
anytime
minute.
soon.
Sir, 1 minute.
Sure.
We are having some
Sure.
cross talks, I think. Can you please check?
Okay.
Can you please
I
check?
will check. I'm actually in a slightly noisy place in the background, so my apologies if it's coming from my side. My apologies. The second barrier is, I think, that good economics doesn't necessarily equal the flow of money. Even if the benefits are compelling, financial and business models to invest in adaptation and resilience don't exist. Benefits are not captured or monetized, and very often we have public benefits versus private costs, and we need to find solutions for that. But the most important, I would argue, is what I would call as policy and institutional challenges. Is adaptation just a problem of development deficits? All we need to do is to just grow, and we'll grow out of the climate crisis. The second problem is a problem of agency. We often say that adaptation is everyone's problem, but then the issue is it becomes nobody's problem. So because there is no single agent responsible for that agenda. And linked to that issue of agency is that it requires distributed action. It requires cross-sector coordination and cooperation, which is a big challenge in the current system of institutions, which are often very siloed. So what's the answer? How do we overcome barriers? What's our strategy? I'd like to touch briefly upon two aspects. The first is what do we do? And the second is how do we ensure that it happens? Adaptation, as has been said, can be thought of as risk management. And risk management involves a balance, a dynamic balance between reduction and prevention, preparation and response, and restore and recovery. And we actually need to do all three. And as we are understanding the links between adaptation and disaster risk management, all of those three need to be done in a balanced way. And that strategy for solutions, I think, needs to rest on three pillars. It needs to rest on better linking knowledge to action. It needs to seek synergies and derive multiple benefits, especially with the development agenda. And it needs to be distributed and heterogeneous, but enabled by policies and institutions. So it is locally led, but it is enabled. Let me move ahead a little bit from here and come actually to the institutional aspects. So one of the interesting approaches now is to think about national adaptation planning and whether national adaptation plans could be used to build an effective institutional response. And I would suggest that there's 7 sort of building blocks of that robust institutional response: governance, the linkages with science and knowledge, the actual plans, policies, regulations, capacity, finance, stakeholder engagement, and monitoring and evaluation. And these building blocks, if put together through a evolving co-produced process, can actually lead to a strategy that fosters implementation. And this process of national adaptation planning can be as important as the plan itself, because it is an evolving and ongoing process, responding to changing circumstances and priorities, where assessments and strategies are revisited, where we link short-term decisions. So one of the big issues in adaptation, for example, is how do we link the short-term humanitarian agenda, which often focuses on relief or post-disaster relief, to longer-term issues of resilience, right? And that's why I said in the beginning that the solution space is not just response, but also includes risk reduction in the first place. And developing a strategy is not an overnight process, and each country will follow a different pathway that is responsive to the local context and the climate risks of that situation. And the underlying political economy will often determine the choices that will be made for how the process is run and the outcomes that will take place. Just to wrap up, adaptation is not a one-time activity. I think the critical insight from the IPCC is that this is a process that requires ongoing action, and therefore a strong institutional mechanism which embed learning and reflexivity, both very hard things to do. There is no single model or approach, but there are a number of building blocks that need to be put into place. And one can think of a NAP process as a way of crafting such a robust and institutional response for adaptation. But just as a final closing thought, are these arrangements capable of dealing with a transformative response to non-marginal change? Or are we still being stuck to doing incremental as opposed to doing radical change that we might need for the most warm futures? Thank you very much. And my apologies for the sound in the background.
Thank you, Dr. Bhattwardhan, for the excellent summary and able to bring to the fore the importance of adaptation. And as you rightly observed, that adaptation brings the developmental agenda to the fore and also integrates our actions and plans to view these issues together and also work at the local, regional, and national level to integrate them. And you also brought in the importance of the institutional aspects. It is not just about talking, but also about the institutional capacity that needs to be built to be responsive, to look at both short-term and longer-term implications of any such plan and how it gets implemented also. So I think now we have some question and session. Dr. Prabhavati, is there anybody locally asking? Then if you could take the mic there.
Yes, sir. We can open up for questions. Yes, Dr. Madhura has a question.
Good evening, Professor Bhattwardhan, and thanks for coming at this odd hour. I really appreciate it, and your sort of broad perspective, which is what we had wanted on the first day, but I'm glad we've got it today. Now, I saw you skip through some slides on nature-based solutions, and I wonder if you can just say a few words about that, because that is something we have been discussing since yesterday, and there have been speakers both sort of critical of it, saying that, the pressure on land-based solutions is then transferring the problem to developing countries, and there have also been speakers sort of saying that as people in this room working in the agricultural sector, that's what we need to think about. So if you could give your perspective on, what is the scope for nature-based solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. And I skipped that slide somewhat, well, partly because I was running late, but also because there was, I suspect, quite a bit of discussion on that topic in the last 2 days. I sort of respond to this at two levels. At the macro level, I think there are certainly questions around, for example, how do we actually achieve the very large negative emissions that many integrated assessment models invoke in order to meet a 1.5 degree target, right? And so it's not quite clear how you do that without compromising food security. Something has to give. There's a fixed resource. You cannot indefinitely increase productivity. But at the micro scale, I think is where in a lot of so one of the themes that I wanted to highlight in my presentation is the notion of multiple benefits, is that where adaptation is likely to work best is where you bring together multiple agendas. So let's say you bring together a livelihoods agenda with a conservation agenda, with a climate resilience agenda. That is, I think, where to me, the biggest scope for NBS lies in the micro, is because it seems to me the one place where you can actually try and connect these policy objectives and agendas together, right? So whether it's about agrobiodiversity in production landscapes combined with improved income and livelihood support, combined with better ability to withstand climate variability, right? So that's, to me, and then you might also get a mitigation benefit, but to me, that's not the critical that should not be the critical driving force. So in my view, a lot of the pressure for NBS that is coming as a mitigation solution, I think, is misplaced. My own sense is it's much more attractive to think about it as an adaptation measure where you integrate development concerns more squarely. Thanks.
Any other questions? Yeah. There are a few more questions. Yes, Dr.
I do have a request. It's a little bit past about 1:30 a.m. at night for me, so I'm wondering if I may beg your indulgence I'd be very happy to respond. If it's possible to forward me those questions, I would be quite happy to respond to them.
Well, I'm in the same situation as Dr. Anand. It's 12:33 a.m. in Peru right now. Thank you.
I think, thank you, Dr. Bhattwardhan, and for joining us, even though the time, as you mentioned, in the different zones. No? So as you wish, we will be able to pass on the questions and get your answers and insights later on. If that is what the conference support team is also agreeing with that, then we can proceed with that thing. And but can we quickly go through some other questions for other panel members?
So my question was for Dr. Madhusudan. So if anybody has questions for Dr. Anand Bhattwardhan or Dr. Vania, so they can ask first if they want to leave.
First. Yes.
Thank you, Namashwam. I think we can continue the discussion and allow this two speakers from North America, South America to leave. Thank you. Thank you for joining.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Bhattwardhan and Dr. Vanya.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. And if there is any further questions, you can definitely please write to me. I'll be happy to discuss and to answer. Thank you very much.
There are questions. We'll get back to you. Yes, thank you.
Oh, perfect. That's perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
So,
yes, please. I think there are...
Sir, there's one more question.
My question is to Dr. Madhusudan. And good that you're working on a model to predict some of the environmental changes like floods. But this climate prediction is often very complex. There are multiple factors. How reliable is your model? How many samples or how many times you have tested it? And what's been the reliability? Do you just predict whether you will have a flood or no flood, or you can also kind of predict the intensity?
So can I also just, the question is on the same line.
Thank you. Thank you, sir, for this question.
So what I wanted to know was that you mentioned that like the GCM, with GCMs, there's a large uncertainties that come along with the GCMs. So how do you, and the regional climate models and the downscaling that you do for like high resolutions, they also use GCM models for that, right? So in a model which we are making, like say for Kerala, for example, how do you downscale it? Which models have you found most feasible for in the Indian conditions? And that's more or less the question.
Can I answer now? So the first question being the models, the situation being complex, the uncertainties being huge, and even the projections are not up to that. How our models work. So that is what the question was. And here, what we are trying to do is to make an impact-based forecasting system. So it's completely different from the current paradigm of what you forecast some rainfall, then you forecast floods. So impact-based forecasting is a different kind of way where you have to understand your impacts prior to an event. That you assume some kind of events So suppose there's 20 centimeters of rainfall tomorrow, what will be your situation? So we will be modeling that for various scenarios for the future. So if you have 20 centimeters of rainfall, if your groundwater condition is 50% saturated, and we have multiple such case scenarios, and we simulate our models and provide our outputs, and we compare with the coming events and we model it. So even before the event, you know that if this happens tomorrow, this will be your impact. Okay? So you can prepare much earlier. So if you combine that, your impact-based modeling, that you already have information that if this happens, this will be the impact. Okay? So now you have a real-time monitoring system of rainfall. So you know that this much of rainfall is already happened up to 6 o'clock today. And if there is 10 centimeters more in the next few hours, what is going to happen? So you are understanding the thresholds of various kinds of events. This is what the impact-based modeling is all about, and we are going towards that. We are in the initial phases. We are collecting data locally. We are building that, and we are going to understand this threshold to identify various kinds of impact models. Yeah, understood. The next one. Is it fine? Am I clear? Yeah. The next one is GCM's issues, and yeah, again here the same kind of answer, because we cannot use GCMs for forecasting floods in the field because they are all erroneous. And when you look at rainfall projections, that's for understanding how your climate will change in the near future or far future with respect to your past historical events. It has nothing to do with forecasting, flood forecasting or other things. It will give you just an idea that your rainfall or temperature will change up to this much. But that idea can be used in an impact-based forecast to understand if there is 1,000 millimeters of rainfall for 3 days, what will happen? That's an event-based thing. Floods are event-based. It's all are event-based. So you have to cull out data from all GCMs to understand extreme situations, extreme conditions, and use it prior and see and run your model and see how that impacts your floods and other droughts and other things. I'm okay? I'm clear? Am I clear? Anything else?
Any other questions from the floor?
Here. Yeah. Anil.
Yes, Dr. Anand.
No, the question actually comment, but triggered from the presentations of Dr. Purvi Mehta and also the adaptation and now by Bhattwardhan. So when we do the adaptation planning, particularly in the context of biodiversity and climate change, the adaptation planning which I am familiar with, it goes with the political boundaries, either it is national adaptation plan or the state level adaptation plan or even subnational law. But if you see the ecosystems, the kind of, for example, if you take agroecological zones, India has got 20 agroecological zones. Do we have such kind of zone-based adaptation planning in this country? Or are we going to have, say, an adaptation plan for Kerala and adaptation plan for the other state? That will be foolish, I would say. It's not scientific. So I'm wondering whether do we have such kind of planning? Because when you talk about a farming system-based adaptation, I would say it should go larger. The agroecological zone-based adaptation planning. Thank you.
Yes, sir, please. There's another question.
Question actually, or a comment flows from your intervention. The causes of climate change need not be where that change occurs. For example, you can have in the South Pacific El Nino, and it can affect the climate or monsoon that's happening elsewhere. Or let's say the Antarctican warming can submerge parts of the coastal Kerala. So I don't know whether we should really start looking at adaptation or even prediction of some of these changes based on local occurrences. Of course, it may be useful for, let's say, flooding in a low-lying area, or how much of the Kuttanad will be submerged in water. But for the larger impact, I think we need to have a global system, because changes happening even on the other side of the globe can have a serious impact on climate, which will significantly impact agriculture and livelihoods of people.
So can I respond to your comment? The issue here, see, our impacts are global and changes are global. But when you look at the local level impacts, it's highly varied. And that variability and the risks associated with that has to be, if you want to address that, you want to reduce the risk related to various kinds of disasters. So I'm specifically saying about disasters because climate change is not going to give you some leeway on that. So these kinds of disasters, if you want to reduce the risk related to such disasters, you need to have very localized understanding of how this change is going to impact your local spaces. Unless and until you don't have this, then I think we don't have much adaptation or mitigation strategies. We cannot plan anything based on that.
So this is not a comment on you, so don't reply to this. But but I think what Narayanan has said, and what Anil said, we're just having a discussion here on certain issues, and I speak as an economist using macro data, but very interested in micro studies. Now, the problem is we cannot have a plan for every village of India. That's impossible. But what we learn from specific villages, specific communities, specific river basins, or whatever region you take, is we have to at some stage identify the principles or changes needed at the higher level. So for example, if you say, just to give an example, that this model didn't work at all in Kuttanad. So there are certain parameters we are missing, or the modeling method is something. Only then, because even your organization cannot be in every village of Ernakulam district. So we learn, and I say as one who has done a lot of years in the field, that we go to the field to learn certain things, certain questions, certain hypotheses which are not being asked or not being adequately dealt with by large-scale models. But we have to also work with those large-scale models. So it's something that I think came out nicely in that last point. Anand Bhattwardhan sort of glossed over, but what he said is that when we work here with agrobiodiversity and livelihood and conservation, we are demonstrating how these three things are actually, I like the word Vanya used, living laboratory, are being implemented in a particular region, and from those lessons, the pluses and the minuses, what we are able to do, what we are not able to do, we speak back to national policy, that these are the things, or state policy, state action plan or national action plan, these are your gaps, these are your things. But we can never succeed in India if we say there will be a plan for every village. Agroeconomic zone is different. I agree that's a failing. And even just to give another example, all our data in the census of India is at the village level. But now the decision making is at the panchayat level. We need to aggregate the data from the village to the panchayat. Because who are your decision makers? They are panchayats which may have more than one, particularly in places like Kerala. Large numbers of people. But we cannot go back to village panchayat and say that is going to be the solution. We have moved to a certain level of decision making. So what I would say in a more general way is that, your experience is very interesting. How can it be integrated with, say, panchayat level decision making? Because we cannot have decision making at every village level. Whatever we say, we cannot have the scientific capacity. At least I see in the next 30, 40 years, if maximum of my lifetime, we are not going to have that kind of scientific skill in every village, and no country in the world has it. So how do we sort of, move between the community? We learn from the village, learn from the community. How do we take it to scaling up? And, how do we improve that scaling up? I think that's something that MSSRF is involved in, and I think all of us can think about a little more. Thank you for giving me this time.
Thank you. I think just to add on to what Dr. Madhura Swaminathan said is, what is really happening is the language of discourse on climate changes and other things also needs to be carefully looked upon. What adaptation central strategy brings in is that it integrates the developmental agenda with the climate response. So, as Dr. Swaminathan always says, that we need to have a people-centric plan, and whatever plan we do, we need to know what are the impacts of that plan for different sections of the people. And as long as we are not doing it, we will become the reactive strategy, which is actually facilitating more greenwashing. For example, many of you know that Shell has a climate mitigation plan where every person who is going to put a petrol in the Shell bank will be asked to pay another, based on the liters, some additional money, which Shell will be investing on planting trees. In fact, Shell has a joint venture in India also with a local company, which will be planting trees. So on the one hand, if you're talking about even climate mitigation or net zero world, it cannot be achieved only through offsetting. So somebody will be continued to consume more and more in some part of the world, and the other part of the world will be planting more trees to mitigate that. That is the discourse we want to change. As observed by Anand Bhattwardhan and others, that it's already 2/3 of emission-related thing is achieved for 1.5. Where 1.5 to 2 will have certain changes in our environment. So how are we preparing ourselves, and how our people have to be equipped is an equally important question. So I feel that putting adaptation as a main strategy changes this fundamental language of how to define the policy, how to define the plan and actions required in our context, especially from the developing world context. I think that's what I would say from what I learned also from other panel members here. I think all the panel members have left now, or?
Sir, all of them have left. I think we will close this session. I would thank the chairman, Mr. N. Namashivayam, for coordinating this session, and also the speakers for their eminent deliberations, and thank you all the participants. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
There is a tea break, and we will reassemble at 11:45. Thank you.